3 hours from now, I'm going to sign away the last dream my wife ever gave me. Thomas Whitmore stared at the stack of papers resting on the small oak table near the window. Outside, rain drifted across the Maine harbor in silver sheets, blurring the lights of fishing boats returning for the evening. Inside tomorrow's harbor, every chair sat empty. Every table stood untouched. The soft yellow lamps reflected across polished wood floors that had once filled him with hope. Now they only reminded him how quiet failure could be. At 74 years old, Thomas had spent most of his life in front of audiences. There had been standing ovations in New York, sold-out performances in Chicago, and grand concert halls in Los Angeles where people paid hundreds of dollars to hear him play. For more than 3 decades, his name had appeared on posters across America. Yet none of those memories felt important tonight. His eyes remained fixed on the blue wool scarf folded neatly on the chair beside his piano. Margaret's scarf. 10 years had passed since she left this world, but Thomas had never found the strength to put it away. Somehow, seeing it there made him feel as though she had only stepped into another room and might return at any moment with that gentle smile he still remembered better than any melody he had ever written. The cafe around him existed because of her. Years earlier, while they sat together watching the sunset paint the harbor gold, Margaret had spoken about creating a place where people could gather without feeling alone. A place filled with music, warm drinks, books, conversation, and kindness. A place where strangers could become neighbors. Thomas had promised her they would build it someday. But life had moved faster than either of them expected. After her long illness, the promise remained unfinished, buried beneath grief and silence. For years he withdrew from the world. He stopped performing. He ignored invitations. He allowed the days to blend together. Then one winter afternoon, while playing piano at a local retirement center, he witnessed something that changed him. An elderly woman struggling with memory suddenly recognized the name of her late husband during one of his songs. Her daughter broke into tears. It was the first clear memory the woman had spoken in years. Thomas drove home that evening, unable to stop thinking about it. If music could still reach someone through years of confusion and loss, perhaps it could still reach him too. That realization became tomorrow's harbor. He invested his savings, purchased an aging waterfront building, and spent months transforming it into the place Margaret had imagined. He believed people would come. He believed the dream would matter. Instead, months passed with empty seats and quiet evenings. Tonight, the papers waiting beside him represented surrender. Thomas slowly lowered himself onto the piano bench and rested his fingers above the keys. Beyond the rain-covered windows, the harbor lights shimmered in the darkness. He took a slow breath and began playing the song Margaret loved most. He did not know that before the night was over, everything was about to change. The melody drifted through the empty cafe long after Thomas lifted his hands from the piano keys. The final notes seemed to linger in the air, mixing with the distant sound of rain tapping against the harbor windows. For a moment, he simply sat there, listening to the silence that followed. Years ago, silence had been comforting. It had given him space to think, to compose, to dream. Now it often felt like an unwelcome companion that arrived every evening and refused to leave. He glanced once more at the transfer papers resting on the table across the room. The buyer had been patient. Too patient, perhaps. The building occupied one of the best locations along the waterfront, and several investors had already expressed interest. All Thomas needed to do was sign his name. Yet something inside him resisted. He stood slowly and walked through the cafe. Each corner carried traces of Margaret's dream. The shelves filled with donated books. The small stage near the fireplace. The photographs of local fishing boats hanging along the walls. Even the teacups had been chosen because they reminded her of places they had visited together during long drives across New England. He paused beside a window overlooking the harbor. The town looked peaceful beneath the rain. A few lights glowed from homes along the shoreline. Somewhere beyond the darkness, a foghorn echoed across the water. 10 years earlier, he would have called Margaret to the window so they could watch the weather together. She had loved storms. She always said they made ordinary evenings feel important. Thomas smiled faintly at the memory. The smile faded almost as quickly as it appeared. Memories could warm a person, but they could not fill empty chairs. Tomorrow's harbor had opened with hope and good intentions. Unfortunately, hope did not pay utility bills. During the first month, He memorized the faces of nearly every customer because there were so few of them. During the second month, he began recognizing which tables remained empty most often. By the third month, even some employees had started looking worried whenever they thought he was not paying attention. Yet none of them complained. They showed up every day. They swept floors, prepared coffee, arranged fresh flowers, and greeted every visitor as though the place were already thriving. Their loyalty touched him more than he ever admitted. A sudden vibration interrupted his thoughts. His phone lit up on the counter. Then it vibrated again and again. Thomas frowned. He rarely received messages this late at night. Assuming it was another automated notification, he ignored it and continued walking toward the piano. The device buzzed repeatedly. Curious now, he picked it up. Dozens of alerts covered the screen. New messages, social media tags, missed calls, notifications arriving faster than he could read them. His confusion deepened. Then he noticed a message from Rachel Dawson, the daughter of the woman from the retirement center. The message contained a simple sentence. "Thomas, I think you should see what is happening right now." He tapped the link she had sent. Within seconds, his world began to change. Thomas watched the screen in disbelief. The video had been viewed only a few hundred times when Rachel first posted it several months earlier. Now the number was climbing so quickly, he could barely follow it. Thousands of views became tens of thousands. Tens of thousands became hundreds of thousands. The recording itself was simple. There was no professional editing, no dramatic music, no special effects. It showed an elderly man sitting at a piano inside a retirement center, playing a gentle melody while a room full of seniors listened quietly. At one point, Rachel's mother softly spoke her late husband's name for the first time in years. Rachel's voice trembled as she explained what that moment meant to her family. The comments beneath the video stretched endlessly. People from across the country shared stories about parents, grandparents, and loved ones whose lives had been touched by music. Others wrote about loneliness, grief, and finding comfort in unexpected places. Many of them thanked Thomas directly, even though most had never met him. He sat down slowly and continued scrolling. The notifications kept arriving. Local news outlets had shared the story. Community groups were discussing it. Former audience members who remembered his concert career were leaving messages of support. Yet the comments that affected him most came from ordinary people. One woman wrote that she had started visiting her father more often after watching the video. Another person said the story reminded him to call his grandmother after months of putting it off. A retired teacher wrote that kindness still mattered because it encouraged other people to be kind as well. Thomas felt something unfamiliar stirring inside him. For years he had measured success through ticket sales, reviews, and applause. Tonight he realized none of those things had created an impact quite like this. He clicked on another notification and discovered dozens of messages asking about tomorrow's harbor. People wanted to know where it was located. They wanted to visit. They wanted to support the cafe. One family wrote that they planned to drive nearly 200 miles that weekend just to stop by. Another message came from a young violin student named Olivia Reed. She explained that she attended a conservatory 2 towns away and wondered whether she could perform at the cafe free of charge. A retired teacher named Henry Wallace offered to organize a weekly book club. A veteran named Jack Mercer volunteered to help repair parts of the outdoor patio before spring arrived. Thomas read every message twice. Outside, the rain continued falling over the harbor. Inside, the cafe no longer felt quite as empty. For the first time in months, he looked around the room and imagined every chair occupied. He imagined conversations filling the air. He imagined music echoing across the waterfront. Most surprising of all, he imagined a future. The transfer papers still waited on the table where he had left them. Thomas walked over, picked them up, and stared at his signature line. Then he carefully folded the documents, placed them back inside the envelope, and set the envelope inside a drawer. The building was not sold. Not tonight. Not yet. The next morning, Thomas arrived before sunrise. The harbor was still wrapped in a pale gray mist, and the water looked almost motionless beneath the quiet sky. For the first time in many months, he felt something that resembled anticipation. Not certainty, not confidence, just the small possibility that perhaps he had been wrong to give up. When he unlocked the front door, he expected another ordinary day. Instead, he found 3 people already waiting outside. A young couple visiting from Portland had driven nearly 3 hours after seeing the video online. They ordered coffee, took photographs of the piano, and spent almost an hour talking with him about music and family. Before leaving, they purchased gift cards for friends who lived nearby. It was a small gesture, but it filled Thomas with unexpected gratitude. By noon, more visitors arrived. Some came because they remembered his performances decades earlier. Others knew nothing about his career and simply wanted to see the cafe from the video. Throughout the day, the bell above the entrance chimed more times than it had during some entire weeks. The staff noticed it too. Their smiles grew easier. Their conversations became livelier. Even the atmosphere seemed different, as though the building itself had awakened from a long sleep. 2 days later, an email arrived from Olivia Reed. She appeared that Saturday, carrying a violin case that looked nearly as large as she was. She was talented, but what impressed Thomas most was her enthusiasm. She played beside the piano for nearly 2 hours while customers listened from their tables. Several visitors remained far longer than they originally intended. Some applauded. Others simply sat quietly and absorbed the music. When the final piece ended, Olivia thanked Thomas for allowing her to perform. Thomas found himself thanking her instead. The following week, Henry Wallace arrived carrying 2 cardboard boxes filled with books. He had spent 35 years teaching literature at a local high school and believed the cafe could become a gathering place for readers. Within days, a corner of the room had transformed into a small community library. Not long after that, Jack Mercer showed up with a toolbox and a list of repairs for the outdoor patio. He worked steadily for hours, refusing any payment beyond a cup of coffee. As spring slowly approached, more people became involved. Local artists offered paintings for the walls. Amateur musicians volunteered for open mic evenings. Retirees organized discussion groups and card games. What surprised Thomas most was how naturally everything happened. No one asked for recognition. No one seemed interested in ownership. They simply wanted to contribute. One evening, after the last customer left, Thomas stood near the entrance and looked around the room. Conversations still echoed faintly in his memory. Empty coffee cups rested on tables. Books sat open where readers had left them. The place no longer felt like a business struggling to survive. It felt alive. As he glanced toward Margaret's blue scarf resting beside the piano, he imagined what she might have thought if she could see the room now. For the first time in years, the memory no longer brought only sadness. It brought comfort. Summer arrived along the coast with bright mornings, crowded sidewalks, and the steady sound of seagulls circling above the harbor. By then, the transformation was impossible to ignore. Visitors traveled from neighboring towns and distant cities. Some came for the music. Others came because they had heard stories about a place where people still took time to listen to one another. Nearly every evening, the tables filled before sunset. The once empty room now carried the warm hum of conversation, laughter, and melodies drifting from the small stage near the fireplace. Thomas often stood quietly near the counter and watched it all unfold. He still found it difficult to believe that the same building he had nearly sold now seemed too small for the number of people who wanted to be there. One Saturday afternoon, every chair was occupied. Olivia performed a collection of classical pieces while a group of local children sat cross-legged near the stage, listening with complete attention. Henry led a book discussion in the corner library section. Jack helped several volunteers install flower boxes along the patio railing overlooking the water. Everywhere Thomas looked, people were creating something together. What moved him most was how naturally strangers connected. A retired fisherman shared stories with college students. Young families sat beside elderly residents from the retirement center. Tourists exchanged recommendations with lifelong locals. The boundaries that normally separated people seemed to disappear once they stepped inside. Late one evening, after most guests had left, Thomas discovered a folded note tucked beneath a coffee cup. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The message was simple. My wife passed away 2 years ago. Since then, I have spent most days alone. Tonight was the first time in a long while that I felt part of something again. Thank you. Thomas read the note 3 times before carefully placing it inside his jacket pocket. During the following weeks, more letters appeared. Some arrived through email. Others were handwritten and left behind anonymously. A woman wrote that the cafe gave her father a reason to leave the house after losing several close friends. A young musician explained that performing there restored her confidence after years of self-doubt. A nurse described bringing exhausted coworkers to evening concerts after difficult shifts at the hospital. Each story carried a different voice, but they all shared the same theme. People were not simply visiting. They were finding belonging. One evening, as the sun settled over the harbor in shades of gold and orange, Thomas sat alone at the piano after closing time. The room was quiet again, but this silence felt entirely different from the one he had known before. It no longer carried loneliness. It carried memory, gratitude, and purpose. His eyes drifted toward Margaret's blue scarf resting beside the piano. For years he had believed he was building this place for her. Now he began to understand something deeper. The dream had never been about preserving the past. It had always been about creating a future where people could care for one another. As he sat there reflecting, a faint pressure tightened briefly across his chest. It disappeared after a few moments, and Thomas dismissed it as fatigue. He had been working long hours and sleeping less than usual. Yet as he looked out toward the darkening harbor, an uneasy feeling settled quietly in the back of his mind, as though life was preparing to remind him once again that even the most beautiful seasons do not last forever. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the harbor in shades of amber and gold. The crowds remained steady, and the cafe continued to thrive, but Thomas could no longer ignore the changes within himself. The brief pressure in his chest that he had dismissed during the summer returned more often. At first it appeared only after long days. Then it began arriving unexpectedly, sometimes while carrying supplies, sometimes while climbing the stairs to his office. Each episode faded after a few minutes, allowing him to convince himself that nothing was seriously wrong. He had spent most of his life overcoming challenges through discipline and patience. Part of him believed this would be no different. Linda Foster, the nurse from the retirement center, noticed his growing fatigue before anyone else. One afternoon, she found him sitting alone near the back patio, staring at the harbor instead of greeting customers as he usually did. She sat beside him and asked a few gentle questions. Thomas answered with a smile and insisted he was simply tired. Linda listened carefully, then reminded him that even strong people sometimes needed help. Her concern stayed with him long after she left. A week later, while finishing an evening performance at the piano, a stronger wave of discomfort forced him to pause between songs. Most guests did not notice, but Olivia did. After the audience departed, she asked whether he was feeling well. Once again, Thomas reassured her. Once again, he avoided the truth. Deep down, he already suspected what he would hear if he visited a doctor. He simply was not ready to hear it aloud. Eventually, the symptoms became impossible to ignore. On a cold November morning, he drove to a medical center nearly an hour away and completed a series of examinations. The tests lasted most of the day. By late afternoon, he sat across from a cardiologist whose expression was calm but serious. The doctor explained that Thomas had a significant heart condition that required treatment. Surgery was recommended sooner rather than later. Without it, the risks would continue increasing. Thomas listened quietly. Outside the office window, bare tree branches swayed in the wind. The words seemed distant, almost unreal. He had spent years fearing loneliness after Margaret's passing. He had never spent much time fearing his own mortality. Yet as he drove home that evening, another fear settled heavily upon him. It was not fear of dying. It was fear of leaving something unfinished. The cafe had become far more than a building. It had become part of people's lives. Every week brought new visitors, new friendships, and new stories. What would happen if he were suddenly gone? That question followed him through the following days. He attended meetings, greeted customers, and performed music as usual, but privately he began organizing documents, financial records, property information, operational instructions. He created folders and notes late into the night. One evening, after everyone had gone home, he opened a drawer and removed the old transfer papers he had nearly signed months earlier. He stared at them for a long time. Then he placed them on his desk once more, uncertain whether he was preparing for recovery or preparing to say goodbye. The date for the procedure was scheduled for early December. As the day approached, Thomas became increasingly quiet. Most people assumed he was focused on holiday preparations or year-end planning. Only a few close friends sensed that something deeper weighed on his mind. He still greeted visitors warmly. He still played the piano each evening. He still listened to stories from customers who had become regulars over the past year. Yet beneath every conversation lingered a question he could not escape. What would happen if he never returned? The answer seemed obvious to him. Without its founder, the place would eventually fade. Businesses closed every day. Communities moved on. Life continued. During the weeks before the surgery, Thomas devoted long hours to organizing every detail he could think of. He reviewed financial accounts, updated records, and prepared instructions for staff members. He created folders labeled with dates and responsibilities. The work gave him a sense of control, even if only temporarily. One cold evening, he remained at the cafe long after everyone else had gone home. The harbor outside was nearly empty. Holiday lights reflected across the dark water, trembling with each small wave. Thomas sat alone at the piano and played softly while looking at Margaret's scarf resting beside him. He remembered the promise he had made years earlier. Back then, the dream had belonged to the two of them. Later, he believed it belonged only to him. Now he was no longer certain. Several days before the procedure, Olivia stopped by unexpectedly. She brought homemade cookies and a stack of handwritten notes collected from customers. Thomas smiled politely and thanked her, but he waited until later that night to read them. One by one, he opened the envelopes. Some contained simple words of encouragement. Others shared personal stories. A widower wrote that the cafe had helped him survive his first lonely Christmas. A young mother explained that her daughter had fallen in love with music after attending weekend performances. A retired nurse described meeting new friends there after moving to town and knowing no one. The letters covered his desk. By midnight, Thomas sat, quietly surrounded by pages filled with gratitude. For the first time, he began to suspect that he might not fully understand what had been created inside those walls. Still, fear remained. On the evening before he was scheduled to enter the hospital, he carried a folder containing transfer documents and contingency plans to the cafe. He intended to leave everything neatly arranged before dawn. If the worst happened, at least the transition would be easier for everyone involved. After placing the folder on a table near the entrance, he walked upstairs to finish a few final tasks. Nearly an hour later, he headed back toward the main floor. As he descended the staircase, he noticed something unusual. Lights spilled through the doorway below. Voices echoed through the building. Music drifted faintly through the air. Thomas stopped midway down the stairs and listened. The cafe should have been empty. Instead, it sounded more alive than ever. Thomas slowly continued down the staircase, expecting to find perhaps a few staff members preparing for the next day. Instead, he stopped at the bottom step and stared in astonishment. The entire room was filled with people. Olivia stood near the piano arranging sheet music with several young musicians. Henry sat beside a group of volunteers organizing books and activity schedules. Jack was helping move tables to create more space near the stage. Along the walls, familiar faces from the retirement center chatted with customers who had become regular visitors. Warm light filled every corner of the room. Laughter drifted through the air. For a moment, no one noticed Thomas standing there. They were too busy working together. Then Olivia looked up. A smile spread across her face. Within seconds, conversations paused and heads turned toward him. Thomas glanced around the room, confused. "What is all of this?" he asked softly. Henry stepped forward holding a clipboard. "The schedule," he replied. "For the next few months." Thomas frowned. "The next few months?" Jack nodded. "While you focus on getting better." Before Thomas could respond, Olivia pointed toward a large calendar hanging near the stage. Every square was filled with handwritten notes, music performances, reading groups, community dinners, volunteer shifts, fundraisers, educational workshops. The calendar extended weeks into the future. Thomas walked closer. More names appeared on the list than he could count. Some belonged to people he knew. Many belonged to visitors he had met only briefly. Yet every slot was covered. Every responsibility had been claimed. "You already knew?" Thomas asked quietly. Linda stepped forward from near the coffee counter. She had been one of the few people aware of his upcoming procedure. "Some of us did," she said gently. "And once people heard, they wanted to help." Thomas looked around the room again. Nobody seemed worried about ownership. Nobody appeared interested in taking control. They were simply making plans, continuing traditions, protecting something they valued. Suddenly, the transfer folder waiting upstairs felt much heavier than it had only an hour earlier. For months, Thomas had believed that everything depended on him. He had convinced himself that if he disappeared, the dream would disappear too. Yet standing there now, surrounded by people voluntarily giving their time and energy, he realized how mistaken he had been. This place no longer survived because of one man. It survived because it mattered to many people. A lump formed in his throat. He turned away briefly and looked toward the piano. Margaret's blue scarf rested exactly where it always had. In that moment, a memory returned with surprising clarity. Years ago, while watching the harbor together, Margaret had once said that the best dreams were never owned. They were shared. Thomas had not fully understood her words back then. He understood them now. Without saying anything else, he walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. The room gradually fell silent. Fingers trembling slightly, he began playing the melody he had written for Margaret many years earlier. No one spoke. No one moved. The music flowed through the room like a quiet conversation between the past and the future. As the final notes faded into silence, Thomas looked around at the faces before him and realized he was no longer afraid. The procedure took place early the next morning. Winter sunlight filtered through the hospital windows as Thomas was wheeled toward the operating room. He felt calmer than he had expected. The fear that had followed him for weeks was gone. In its place was a quiet sense of peace. The night before had changed something inside him. For years he had carried the weight of responsibility alone. Now he understood that the future did not rest entirely on his shoulders. As he closed his eyes, he thought of Margaret, of the harbor, of the music, and of the countless people whose lives had become connected through a dream that was once shared by only two people. Hours later, when Thomas opened his eyes in recovery, the room felt unfamiliar and distant. Machines hummed softly nearby. Snowflakes drifted past the window outside. For a few moments, he simply breathed and listened. Then he noticed his phone resting on the bedside table. A new message waited on the screen. It was from Olivia. Attached was a video. Thomas pressed play. The recording began inside the cafe. Every table was occupied. The fireplace glowed warmly. Henry welcomed guests near the entrance. Jack poured coffee for several visitors. Rachel sat beside her mother, who smiled peacefully while listening to the music. Then the camera slowly turned toward the piano. A small group of musicians sat together performing the melody Thomas had played the night before. The room listened in complete silence. Some people smiled. Others wiped away tears. Yet what touched Thomas most was not the performance itself. It was the feeling that nothing had stopped. Life had continued. The dream was still alive. As the video ended, a final message appeared on the screen. "We will keep the lights on until you come home." Thomas lowered the phone and felt tears fill his eyes. Not tears of sadness. Not even relief. They were tears of gratitude. For the first time since Margaret passed away, he no longer felt alone carrying her memory. Months later, spring returned to the harbor. Visitors walking along the waterfront often noticed an elderly man tending flower boxes outside a familiar gathering place overlooking the ocean. Many recognized him. Immediately. Others did not. It rarely mattered. Thomas preferred it that way. Most afternoons he could be found watering plants, greeting visitors, or sitting quietly near the window with a cup of tea. Inside, music continued almost every evening. Books changed hands. Friendships formed. New traditions appeared. The blue scarf remained beside the piano exactly where it had always been. Not as a reminder of loss, but as a symbol of everything that had grown from love, memory, and hope. One evening, after another community concert, Thomas sat at the piano and looked across the crowded room. The scene before him was far more beautiful than anything he had imagined when he first unlocked the building years earlier. He smiled, rested his hands gently on the keys, and spoke the words that had gradually become the heart of the place. "As long as the music plays, tomorrow is still waiting for us." Beyond the windows, the harbor lights shimmered across the water while gentle waves rolled toward the shore, carrying that promise into the night.